The first thing anyone saw when Nora Voss drove back into Harlan Flats with that herd was the dust. 22 head of cattle so thin their hip bones cast shadows in the afternoon sun, trudging down the center of Main Street behind a wagon with a cracked axle, guided by a young woman who had not slept in 31 hours and who held the lead rope like she had been born with it, wrapped around her hand. The postmaster stepped out onto the porch and took his hat off, not in greeting, but in something closer to disbelief. The miller's wife pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Children scattered off the boardwalk into the yellow grass to stare, and from the doorway of the feed store, a man named Caleb Drought folded his arms across his chest and said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that he had always suspected the Voss girl had lost her sense, but that now he had the proof of it walking right past his window. 22 heifers, bought for $35 and an iron plow her father had left behind, $1.59 apiece on average. The arithmetic was not the part that gave Harlan Flats pause, the arithmetic they could follow. What stopped them, what made the postmaster forget to put his hat back on, was something else entirely. It was the spring. But to understand the spring, you have to go back to where it began, which was not in Harlan Flats at all, 14 months earlier. Nora Voss was 22 years old, which people in Harlan Flats found young enough to dismiss, but old enough to hold responsible for her own poor decisions. She had come into the county seat of Prescott on a Tuesday in April to sell 3 good laying hens and her mother's spare shawl, because the property tax bill that had arrived that month was $7.40, and she had $4 and a handful of pennies to her name. The land she was trying to hold on to, 312 acres her parents had broken from hard clay and short grass prairie before a fever took them both inside of one November, was described in the county rolls as marginal. The east 60 was rocky. The north pasture drained poorly, and the south section, a wide flat basin of pale sand and bunch grass that lay at the far end of a dry creek bed, was considered by every cattleman in the county to be the most useless piece of ground a person could own, good for nothing but watching the horizon from. She was standing outside the livestock auction, counting and recounting what she could get for the hens, when a drover named Hatch came out of the pen gate sweating and cursing quietly. Behind him, down a chute, and into a small side lot, came the most wretched cattle she had ever seen. 22 black baldy heifers, ranging from 2 to 4 years old, all of them ribby to the point of embarrassment, their coats rough and staring, their eyes sunken with dehydration. Hatch had driven them 90 miles from a failed ranch to the west, a ranch that the drought of the last 2 summers had picked clean, and he was trying to sell them for $50 the lot. Nobody was bidding. The lot foreman gave the heifers a look that suggested he had seen more promising animals on their way to the rendering works, and the 2 buyers present were after finished stock, not charity cases. Hatch dropped his price to $40, then to $35. The buyers shook their heads and walked on. Nora stood at the fence and looked at those heifers for a long time. She looked at the way they stood, not the broken, defeated stand of animals too far gone, but the careful, preserving stillness of animals that were conserving the last of what they had. She looked at their frames, which under the sunken flesh were long and broad through the hip, correct through the shoulder. She was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that a good frame was a promise, and that a promise was worth something if you had the patience and the ground to let it pay out. She paid Hatch $35, the 4 she had, plus the value of her mother's shawl set against $1 she owed Hatch's brother for a wagon repair, plus the auction day price for the 3 hens, and she took possession of 22 starving heifers with no immediate means to feed them properly, and a property tax bill she still had not paid. An old man watched this transaction from the water trough, where he had been sitting in the shade cleaning a leather harness. His name was Emil Strausch, and he had come to the county 30 years earlier from a village in Bavaria, and had farmed the creek bottom north of Harlan Flats until his wife died, and his sons moved east, and now he farmed a small piece of it alone, and grew a kitchen garden that was considered something of a marvel in a county where the ground begrudged every green thing. He had white hair and large rough hands, and eyes the pale color of late November sky. When Nora led the first heifer out of the lot on a rope, he said, without looking up from the harness, "Those are good-boned cattle," and she said, "I know it." He said, "The South Basin on your father's place. That sand flat," she said, "yes." He said, "Old River Bottom, that ground." "You know what Old River Bottom does when you go down far enough?" She said she did not. He set the harness across his knee and looked at her directly for the first time. "It finds water," he said. "You push down through the sand with something simple, and let the ground tell you where to push, and Old River Bottom will find water for you. The drought beats the clay. It does not beat the sand. Remember that." She did not know yet that she would be remembering it for the rest of her life. The drive back to Harlan Flats with 22 half-dead heifers on foot was 37 miles and took 2.5 days. She slept at the edge of the road the first night, sitting upright against a wheel with the lead rope around her wrist, and woke to find all 22 heifers lying down in a loose cluster around the wagon, which she took as a reasonable sign that they had decided to live. By the time she came down Main Street in the cloud of red dust, she had been 3 days without a proper meal, and she held herself on the seat of that wagon through what seemed to her a straight act of will. Caleb Drood's voice followed her down the street. She did not look at him. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not right yet. She was $35 poorer, 312 acres away from being right, and surrounded by a chorus of skeptics who were already composing the next chapter of the Voss girls' famous poor judgment. She let them compose it. She had work to do. The South Basin was everything the county said it was, and more. It was pale and flat, and about as welcoming as the face of the moon. A wide sandy depression, ringed by low-cut banks, where the old creek had wandered before it dried. The bunch grass grew in sparse clumps, not enough to feed 22 animals through a summer, and the nearest reliable water was the tank behind her barn, which was fed by a windmill that worked on good days and groaned on bad ones. She counted the arithmetic in the dark the first night. 22 heifers, each one needing at current condition about 15 pounds of dry forage daily to begin recovering. Her barn hay would last, if she was careful, 6 weeks. Then she would need grass, and she would need water, because without water in that South Basin, the grass would not come in, and without the grass she could not send the heifers down there to graze through the summer. She started the next morning with a fence, not the South Basin fence, which would come later. The pen fence around the barn lot, to keep the heifers close where she could watch them and feed them by hand if it came to that. She spent 3 days on the fence alone, digging post holes through caliche in the heat, tamping the posts with a wooden bar until her shoulders burned, and her hands bled along the old calluses and formed new ones over those. She named none of the heifers. That was a rule she had made, because named cattle were cattle you made poor decisions about. The rule lasted until the 3rd day, when the smallest heifer, a dark-faced, narrow animal she had privately thought would not survive the week, pulled the sleeve of her work shirt through a gap in the fence boards and refused to let go until Nora stood there and allowed herself to be inspected. After that she was named Persimmon, and the rule was done, and by the end of the month all 22 had names, which the neighboring rancher's 12-year-old daughter, May Tollefson, helped supply on her after-school visits and considered among the finest creative work of her life. May had begun appearing at the fence line about a week after Nora returned, drawn by the heifers the way children are drawn by any creature in a state of obvious need. She was a serious, gap-toothed girl who wore her brown hair in a braid so tight it looked architectural, and who had a gift for stillness that made the cattle accept her almost immediately. She helped carry water pails and spread hay and pull dock weed from the barn lot, and in return Nora let her name the Heifers and told her what she observed about each animal's recovery, which May recorded in the back of a school notebook with the focused attention of someone taking minutes at an important meeting. Nora was glad of the company, though she did not say so. She was not a woman who said the easy things easily. By the end of May, 3 of the worst heifers had recovered enough to eat without supervision. By early June, the whole herd was eating steadily, and Nora began reducing the supplemental hay and letting them graze the pasture behind the barn down to the roots. They gained weight noticeably. She could see it changing the line of their backs, filling in the hollows above the hip. The frames her father had taught her to value were proving themselves. A man from the neighboring spread, Tollefson Sr., came by one afternoon ostensibly to discuss a fence line dispute they had been ignoring for 2 years, and spent most of the visit looking at the heifers with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral. "Those are coming around," he said finally. She said, "Yes, they are." He said nothing more about the fence. But June was also when the creek stopped running. It had been a dry spring, even by the standards of a dry country, and by the middle of June, the creek that ran along the county road was down to a ribbon of brown water in the deepest bend. By the last week of June, it was gone. The talk in town was careful at first, the careful talk of people who had survived dry years and knew better than to say the word drought out loud too early, as if naming it would fix it in place. By the 4th of July celebration in the square, there was no careful talk left. The word was said openly. The sky had been a hard, clean, empty blue for 6 weeks, and it was the blue of a thing that had made up its mind. Nora heard Emil Strauch's voice in her head about 4 days before she would have arrived at the idea herself. Old River Bottom finds water. She went to the South Basin on a Friday morning with a sharpened iron bar, a post hole digger, a ball of string, and the better part of a day's worth of stubbornness. She paced the basin from one end to the other, reading the ground the way Emil had half described and she half intuited, looking for the places where the sand lay different, slightly lower, slightly darker at the surface in the early morning before the sun burned the moisture off. And she pushed the iron bar down at each such spot and noted how the soil changed with depth. 3 spots she marked with string-staked flags. Then she went home and drove her wagon to Emil Strauch's farm, arriving at supper time without announcement and accepting without ceremony the bowl of potato soup he put in front of her before she could explain why she had come. He told her what she needed to know over that bowl of soup and a second one, and a cup of coffee after, and he drew the principle of it on the back of an envelope with a carpenter's pencil. Not a well, not exactly. A driven point, a simple pipe with a screened tip hammered down through the sand to the water-bearing layer that old river sediment almost always held, because sand, unlike clay, did not compact against a thin blade of water. It held it instead, distributed it, gave it room. The drought was burning the surface off the clay all over the county. But the sand did not give its water up that way. The sand was a vault. You had to know how to open it. He had done it once, he said, on a piece of ground very like her South Basin. He believed she could do it on hers. He believed the water was there. She borrowed his pipe driver and 2 lengths of pipe and gave him nothing in return because he refused anything, and she started the following Monday before sunup, with May Tollefson standing at the edge of the basin, watching with the school notebook pressed to her chest. The driving was brutal work. She did not have a proper rig, so she improvised one from a fence post mounted on a crossbar in the wagon bed, and she drove the pipe by lifting a weighted iron cap and dropping it, lifting and dropping, each blow advancing the pipe a fraction of an inch into the sand. The first spot produced nothing useful. She pulled the pipe by hand, bleeding through her gloves, and moved to the second flag. 2 feet down the resistance changed. 3 feet down the rod came out with a different color of sand clinging to it, darker, with a faint mineral smell that made her close her eyes for a moment. She drove another foot. Then another. Then water came over the lip of the pipe in a slow, colorless, impossibly clean thread, and May Tollefson made a sound that was not quite a word in any language, but was perfectly comprehensible. Nora knelt in the sand and let the water run over her fingers. She did not tell the town. She told Emil Strauch and May, and no one else. May, to her enormous credit, kept the secret with the seriousness of a person who understood that some things need time before the world is ready to see them. Nora spent the next 2 weeks connecting the pipe to a simple trough in the South Basin, moving her heifers down there by day to graze the bunch grass and drink from the spring, and driving them back to the barn lot at night. The grass in the basin, which the sand water rose up to from beneath, was greener than the grazing anywhere else on her land. It was greener than the grazing on almost any land she could see from the cut-bank rim. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, which was quietly and completely, and without saying anything about it to anyone who had not earned the right to know. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in a secret that is also a truth. She carried it the way you carry a coal banked low under ash, carefully with both hands, keeping the heat where you need it. By August, the heifers were not thin anymore. They were not merely recovered, they were, it had to be said, genuinely impressive cattle. The frames her father had taught her to look for had paid out exactly as promised. They were broad through the hip and deep through the chest, with a kind of quiet authority in their movement that good beef cattle acquire when they have been allowed to become what their breeding intends. Persimmon, the small, dark-faced one, had become the largest of the lot, which Nora found satisfying in a way she could not quite articulate, but which had something to do with the general principle that the thing everyone writes off most confidently is sometimes the one that proves the point. The arithmetic counted in the dark in early August, 22 heifers. Purchase price, $35 and a plow. 6 weeks of supplemental feed, $11. Fence materials, $4 and change. Pipe and fittings, $2.50. Total invested, something under $53. Current market value of the herd, if she were to sell them that day at Prescott, somewhere between $280 and $310. She did not plan to sell them. She planned to breed them. She was thinking several years ahead, which in Harlan Flats was considered either admirable or suspicious, depending on who was doing it. It was Caleb Drought who first noticed the pasture condition. He drove past the South Basin cut bank in late August on his way to his own North Range and stopped his wagon in the road for what seemed to his hired hand like an unnecessarily long time. His own cattle were thin. The creek range he had depended on for 30 years had dried to cracked gray mud in July, and he had sold down his herd by 40% and was still not sure the remainder would winter well. The Voss girls' South Basin, visible from the road, was green in a way the rest of the county had forgotten green looked. He drove on without stopping at her gate. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third visit, he got down from the wagon and stood at the cut bank rim and looked for a long time without saying anything. He did not knock at her door. He was not the sort of man who knocked at doors he was embarrassed to be seen at. But Harlan Flats was small and had good eyes, and within a week there were 6 different versions of what Caleb Drought had seen circulating through the feed store and the post office, each version more elaborated than the last. The version that reached the cattle dealer from Prescott, a man named Harwick, was that the Voss girl had somehow found surface water on the sand basin that no one had thought to look for, and that her cattle were the best conditioned animals in the county. Harwick drove out on a Thursday in early September in a good suit that was already dusty before he reached her gate, and he was the first person from outside her immediate circle to see the spring and the herd together. He stood at the trough for several minutes in the manner of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had thought he had correctly understood. He offered Nora $140 for the lot. She said no. He said $165. She looked at him the way her father had looked at things he was deciding about. She said, "These cattle are not for sale, Mr. Harwick." Then she offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted, and over the cup she told him what she was thinking, not as a business proposition, not yet, but as the straightforward account of a person who had done the arithmetic and knew what it said. She was going to winter the herd, breed them in the spring, and sell the calves at 2.5 years. She expected by the 3rd year to have a self-sustaining operation that did not depend on the creek running and did not fold when the sky went hard and blue. Harwick looked at her over his cup for a moment. Then he said, "If you bring calves to my Prescott yard, I will give you fair market on the day, no discount for the seller being," he paused, searching, "unconventional." She said, "I know the Prescott Day prices, Mr. Harwick." He said, "I expect you do." He went back to his good dusty suit and his wagon, and that was that, except that he mentioned her name to a restaurateur in Prescott who was looking for reliable beef supply, and the restaurateur drove out the following week with his cook, who was a large red-faced woman named Hedvika, who said nothing for 10 minutes, and then put her hand flat on the flank of the nearest heifer and said in an accent that could have come from the same village as Emil Strauss, "These animals are eating something the others are not eating. What are they eating?" Nora told her about the sand spring. Hedvika listened with the expression of a person fitting a key into a lock that has been shut for some time. She placed an order for her first 2 animals before she was back in the wagon. It was the kind of confirmation that costs nothing to give and means everything to receive. Then September came in like a kicked door. The drought had been bad. What arrived in the first week of September was worse. A dry wind off the southwest for 11 days running, hot, with a weight to it that seemed to press the color out of everything. What little green had survived the summer on the clay ground around Harlan Flats went gray. The creek did not return. 2 ranchers on the South Road sold their remaining cattle at whatever they could get and did not come back to their properties for a week. The county held its breath. On the 9th day of the wind, Nora walked the South Basin at dawn. The spring was running, not the way it ran in a wet year, not abundantly, but running. The trough held a steady level. The bunch grass in the basin was dry along the blade, but rooted and alive, drawing from the moisture in the sand below. She watched the surface of the water in the trough for a while, the way it moved in the wind, and she felt something she would not have described as certainty, because she was not a woman given to certainties, but it was adjacent to certainty. It was the knowledge of a person who has tested a thing thoroughly enough to trust it. On the 4th day of the wind, old Tollefson Sr. came to her gate in the evening. He did not have his hat, and he had not shaved that day, and both of these things were unlike him. He had 16 head left, he said, and no water he could trust, and he would be obliged if he could water them at her trough every other day until the wind broke, if she could spare it and if she'd name a fair price. She looked at him for a moment. He was a proud man who had farmed his ground competently for 20 years and had never needed to ask this of anyone, and the asking had cost him something. She said, "Bring them in the morning, and we'll see what the spring can carry." He said, "I want to pay." She said, "I know you do. We'll settle it when the wind breaks." The wind broke on the 14th day. By then she had been watering Tollefson's 16 in the mornings and her own 22 in the afternoons, and the spring had held the load. Not easily. The trough level had dropped by midday for the last 3 days of the wind, and she had watched it with the particular attention of a person counting something they cannot afford to lose. But it had held. There were 2 other ranchers who had come quietly to the basin during those 14 days, having heard from Tollefson that the water was there. She had watered their animals too. She had not named a price in advance for any of them. She was keeping count of the days and the head count and the water drawn, and she would settle accounts after, and she would settle them fairly. She had not done it to be owed. She had done it because the arithmetic of the situation was simple, and she could read it. She had the water, they needed the water, and a town is not a thing you live in and also let die. It was during those 14 days that Caleb Drood's hired hand came to her gate. Drood had not come himself. He had sent the man, which was a thing of a certain kind, and the man was clearly embarrassed to be there, which was not his fault. He said Mr. Drood had some cattle that needed water, and asked what she was charging. She said, "The same I'm charging everyone, which is what the spring can carry and what the day requires." He said Mr. Drood would like to know the price in advance. She said, "Tell Mr. Drood the price is fair, and that I will know the count of his cattle before they arrive, so he should send the true number." The man looked at her a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he nodded and went. Drood's cattle arrived the next morning. There were 19 of them, which was the number she had expected, having spoken to enough people in those 2 weeks to form a fair picture of who had what. She watered them with the others and kept the count in her book. After the wind broke and the sky went soft again, she settled accounts at the feed store on the first Monday of October. She was not the type for ceremony, but she had laid out the figures in her book with precision, and she read them plainly to each man as he came to settle. To Tollefson she said, 14 days, 16 head, twice daily at the trough. That's fair priced at $4 even, and I will take it in hay come December. Tollefson paid her in $4 and shook her hand. To the other 2 smaller ranchers she gave figures they called more than fair. To Drood's representative, Drood had not come himself, which told her what she needed to know about the kind of man he was. She gave the same honest accounting she had given the others. 19 head, 14 days. The same price per head per day she had charged everyone, totaling $5.80. The representative paid it and turned to go. Then he stopped and turned back. He said, "Mr. Drood wants to know how you knew the count was 19 and not 14. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Because I asked around, same as I always do. He wants to know who told me. He can come and ask me himself." The man looked at the ground. Then he said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, those cattle were 19. She said, "I know they were. Thank you for saying so." That was the last she heard from Drood directly, but it was not the last she heard about him. 3 weeks later, the word came through the feed store. Harlan Flats was a small place with a long memory, that Drood had offered to purchase Emil Strauch's creek bottom parcel for less than half its assessed value, claiming the drought had ruined the land, and the old man had no means to maintain it. Emil had declined. The offer had been made twice more, each time lower. Emil had declined each time in the same patient, quiet way that Emil did everything. When Nora heard this, she drove her wagon to Emil's farm on a Sunday afternoon with a jar of preserves and sat at his table for an hour. She said, "If he comes again, I want to know." Emil said, "He will come again." She said, "Then I want to know." He studied her for a moment with his November sky eyes. Then he said, "What I told you about the sand, do you remember the rest of what I said?" She said, "You told me the drought beats the clay and does not beat the sand." He nodded slowly. He said, "The rest is this. A man who owns something and does not understand it will always try to buy it from the man who does. The thing to do is to understand your land so thoroughly that there is nothing left for him to purchase." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I think I'm working on that." He said, "I believe you are." Drood came back to Emil in November with a lawyer's letter asserting that the creek bottom parcel had been informally fenced across the county road right-of-way, and that certain improvements on it were technically in violation of a property ordinance from 1887 that nobody in Harlan Flats had thought about in 30 years. It was the move of a man who had discovered that patience wasn't working and had decided to try paper instead. The letter gave Emil 60 days to respond or vacate a strip of fence on the creek bottom boundary. Nora took the letter to the county seat herself, driving the 40 miles to Prescott on a cold Tuesday in November with Emil's copy of the original land deed, which she had asked him to let her borrow, and which he had handed her with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask for it. She spent 3 hours at the county land records office and 1 hour with a county surveyor who owed her nothing, but who was interested enough in the deed, which predated the 1887 ordinance by 8 years, and included specific road right-of-way language that superseded it, to pull the original survey maps and confirm what the language said. The strip of fence Drought was objecting to was legally Emil Strauch's. The ordinance did not apply. The letter was, as the surveyor put it, the kind of thing a man sends when he is hoping the other man doesn't know how to read a deed. She came back to Harlan Flats with the surveyor's written opinion and Emil Strauch's deed and a bill for the surveyor's time, which she had paid herself. She delivered these to Emil's table that evening with another jar of preserves because she had already made 2 batches and did not want to seem like she was bringing only legal documents. Emil read the surveyor's opinion twice. Then he folded it neatly and set it on the table and looked at her. He said, "This is more than I expected." She said, "It's what the deed said." He said, "The cost." She said, "Don't." He was quiet for a moment. He poured coffee. He said, "Drought will hear about this." She said, "He already knows what the deed says. He just hoped you didn't." Emil looked at the fire for a while. Then he said, "You know what this land looked like when I first broke it?" She said she didn't. He said, "It looked like nothing. It looked like a thing no one could use. I planted it anyway because I could see what it was, not what it looked like." He picked up the surveyor's opinion and put it in the drawer with his good papers. He said, "I think you and I rid the land the same way." She did not say anything. She drank her coffee. The fire moved. It is worth telling what Harlan Flats looked like by the spring that followed. Nora's 22 heifers were bred in January and February, with a bull she had arranged to borrow from Tollefson in exchange for winter water access, a fair trade that both of them understood perfectly and neither of them over-discussed. The herd was by then visibly, undeniably fine stock. Even Tollefson, who kept his evaluations brief by temperament, had taken to stopping at the South Basin fence when he drove past, not saying anything, just looking. May Tollefson, now 13, and considerably taller than she had been in the summer, was still keeping the notebook. It had expanded to a second volume. The calves came in late October and November, 19 of them. The other 3 heifers would follow the next spring, Emil had predicted, based on the timing of their breeding, and he was right. 19 calves from the first 19 heifers in a drought year, all of them healthy, most of them exceptional. The arithmetic had a new column. Hedvika's restaurateur came back with a larger order. Harwick came back and did not mention buying the herd. He discussed prices for calves, which was a different conversation entirely, and the prices they arrived at were fair ones because she knew the figures and held to them, and he respected that, not immediately, but eventually. There was a day in November when several of the townspeople from Harlan Flats drove past the South Basin Road on their way to some other errand, and did what people in that county always did when they passed the Voss place now, which was slow down to look. What they saw was the spring trough catching the late afternoon light, and the calves moving through the bunch grass, and the spring trough running thin but clear, and the heifers, heavy now, all 22 of them, carrying the weight and calm authority of animals that had been fed and watered and trusted to become what they were. Moving in the long slanted gold of an October evening like the whole scene was something a person might have arranged on purpose. The postmaster, coming by in his wagon, pulled up at the cut-bank for a long moment. He had a habit of taking his hat off when he didn't know what else to do, and he took it off now. Behind him, coming up the road in the early dusk, Caleb Droud's wagon passed without stopping. It did not stop, but it slowed. Nora was at the trough when they passed. She did not look up. She was watching the water level, running her hand along the pipe, fitting where there had been a slow seep earlier in the week that she had since repaired. The work was steady, and the spring was sound, and the animals were well, and the arithmetic, counted that night at the kitchen table with a stub of candle, and the book May had left her, was this: $53 invested, 14 months, $412 in current asset value, plus the calf contracts with Hedvika's buyer, plus a reputation in the county that Caleb Drought had tried in 2 different ways to damage and had failed in both, plus one neighbor's land preserved from a man who wanted it, plus the knowledge of how to open what the drought could not close. It was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that had a shape to it, that you could hold in both hands and feel the weight of. Emil Strauch came by on the first Saturday of November to help her reset 2 fence posts that the dry summer had loosened, which was the reason he gave, and she accepted it as the reason, and asked no other. They worked through the morning, and at midday she made coffee, and they sat on the cut-bank above the south basin with their cups, and looked at the herd below. After a while Emil said, "When I told you about the sand, did you believe me?" She said, "I didn't disbelieve you." He said, "That is how a practical person believes a thing they cannot yet see." She considered this. She said, "I think my father knew about Old River Bottom. I think he bought that south basin knowing what it was." Emil said, "A man who buys ground that looks like nothing, when he could have bought better, usually knows something." She looked out at the basin. She said, "He just didn't have time to prove it." Emil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now you do." The herd moved in the afternoon light below them, unhurried and heavy and at peace, in the way that well-fed cattle are at peace, with a kind of settled, uncomplicated certainty that the ground beneath them is good and the water in the trough is clean, and the morning will come the same as the morning always comes. The spring ran beneath the sand in its patient, voiceless way, doing what Old River Bottom does when you let it, holding water against the drought, keeping it for the moment when it is needed, giving it back to the surface in a thin, clear, dependable thread that had outlasted the hard blue sky and the dry wind, and the men who had tried to say the land was worth nothing. It had always been there. It had been waiting for someone who knew how to read what a thing was, and not only what it looked like. The 22 heifers, bought for $35 and a plow, grazed on.